Over the last few years, the LGBT movement has achieved many victories, but few have seriously questioned what needs to be done after achieving these victories. Fewer still have wondered what the well-financed LGBT organizations have been doing in the face of social ills like a declining community and rampant substance and mental health issues. This is all within a context of wider society becoming more and more tolerant of GLBT people. In this special, we are going to be going over what some LGBT charities are doing and what needs to be done. But first, we must go back to Stonewall and start our story there. There are some misconceptions that need to be cleared up before we can get into the meat and potatoes of this special. Everyone who is a part of the GLBT demographic in the United States should know that the movement started in 1969 after the Stonewall riot. How it started and what we are taught are not necessarily the same thing. The Stonewall Inn was a bar for working class gay men, and Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson didn't even claim to be there when the riot started, but rehashing that old history is not the point of this special. It's an analysis of where the movement is, why it got there, and what needs to be done today. The GLBT movement as a movement wasn't cohesive or even nationwide when it got off the ground in the early 1970s. GLBT groups were local, meaning that a group in New York City only cared about politics in New York State. For the most part, there were variations within all that. The normal, not everyone is the same. But anyways, one such group was the Gay Activists Alliance. It formed after some men broke off of the Gay Liberation Front. These men were Jim Oles, Marty Robinson, Arthur Evans, Arthur Bell, and K. Tobin Lawson. The Gay Liberation Front was more or less what you'd expect out of some of the extreme social justice advocates of today. They talked more about liberating people from perceived oppression rather than working towards realistic goals. The GAA instead led demonstrations that would get a lot of press attention. They called them ZAPs. They did this to bring attention to gay issues and push New York City and New York State for gay rights legislation. They were also the first to adopt the lambda as their symbol, and as a further dig to the Gay Liberation Front, GAA chapters spread across the United States and pushed state and local governments for civil rights legislation. Also in the 1970s, there was a wave of lesbian separatism. Lesbian separatism rose out of the notions that the straight women's movement, being contemporary feminism, at least in the 1960s, and the male left were insufficient to help lesbians, and that they needed to separate themselves to build non-exploitative communistic societies where they could discover themselves and create a political lesbian identity. Modern feminists, on the other hand, don't consider this its own ideology, but as a process to work towards social revolution and cultural change. This is the opinion of one feminist who has studied this and wrote a paper about it in 2014. But from what can be gathered, this is the first major example of communistic rhetoric leading into lesbian advocacy. And since at least one person in the last 40 years has seen this as a good and positive thing within the GLBT demographic, it is safe to say that a lot of people in the intervening years found this to be a very worthwhile process. And not only that, but lesbian separatism was well alive into the 80s in the beginning of the HIV crisis, but also at the same time there were other lesbians that were just traveling around in vans like old hippies, and that more or less kept going till around the same time period. But to transition now to the HIV crisis. The HIV crisis, as everyone knows, is one of the biggest gay crises that was ever faced by GLBT people in modern history, safe to say. I mean, despite what people might say about discrimination, having a disease disproportionately and dying from it was a big issue. And when HIV started spreading, that's when GLBT activism started becoming more national, more organized, more political, because gay men were getting sick and dying, and the government at the time wasn't particularly gay friendly, and neither were the Democrats. Either at the same time don't, whataboutisms. It was not a good time to be gay and in politics. But for example, Reagan didn't even use the term HIV or AIDS until the 5th year of his presidency. And also there were a lot of doctors at the time that wouldn't treat HIV patients because they weren't sure how the disease spread until about, I think, 1983 as the general timeline. And up until that point, a lot of airlines wouldn't even let people with HIV and AIDS fly in their planes because they thought it could spread through casual contact like the cold. And if you've ever been on a flight, you know that spreading of diseases is always a top concern for a lot of people traveling. And at the time, HIV still isn't curable, but there was no treatment for it that would extend your life. But during this time period, two notable organizations formed, and one of them was the Gay Men's Health Crisis, and the other one was ACT UP. Both of them still exist today, and they both started in the 1980s in New York City. The Gay Men's Health Crisis was started in 1982 to help support people with HIV and advocate for them and provide just other material support and fundraising. It was started by a group of men named Nathan Fain, Larry Kramer, Larry Mass, Paul Popham, Paul Rappaport, and Edmund White. The first thing they did was to create a hotline for 8 people who have been diagnosed with HIV to call for support. They wrote and distributed newsletters to medical practitioners, as well as set up buddy systems for people with HIV to support each other, or even non HIV-infected volunteers. They also advocated at medical and political conferences, raised money for research, and also did a lot to take care of people who were dying of HIV and AIDS. Also, a fun fact is they did hold the first AIDS walk in New York City in 1986, where they raised over $700,000 for research. But with all of this good things that they've done, advocating for better medical research, raising money, providing material support to people with HIV, not everyone was happy with what they were doing. They thought more needed to be done, just like is the case with all politics. Someone always thinks more needs to be done, which is where the organization ACT UP comes in. Now, I may be advocating for the idea that we need to be less political, but at the time, this was very necessary, and it still in some ways could be in the future, but as we'll get into it later in the special, that threat may never come to pass, at least not anytime soon. But anyways, ACT UP started as an activist organization, unlike the gay men's health crisis. They thought they weren't putting enough pressure on the federal government to help gay men facing AIDS crisis. Or to put it more bluntly, they weren't content with just providing material support to people with HIV, and they wanted to put pressure on the government. So ACT UP went down the political route, having sit-ins, protests, you name it, they did it, and they did what they could to put more pressure on the government to help people with HIV. This group, by the way, still in its chapters still largely exist in big cities today. Now they're focusing on Trump, which gets further into the idea that maybe we need to evolve past the political aspect, or the political aspect taking primacy in our community or demographic, whichever you want to go with. And as we will get into the special, we will explain that further. But the main point with this section is to show that the organizations from the beginning of Stonewall up through even the HIV crisis, they were largely started by men, generally run by men. I mean, there were some lesbians there, but it was generally men's organizations started by men, led by men, and men did a lot of the work. The normal line, even about the HIV crisis, is that feminists, mostly lesbians, did all the work and gay men just laid around and died. From what little evidence that can be found outside of one Vice article are some passing references to lesbians who were friends who had a lot of gay men, and they were helping their friends and neighbors die during the height of the crisis. And even from what I can gather from my own social circle is that it was largely friends and family helping their gay relatives during the crisis, whether they were lesbian or straight or whatever. But they definitely aren't the feminists that are around now telling us that we, a generation later, need to be grateful for what they did for us, even though we're both a generation removed from this. And as I said, the people that helped have largely gone on back to their life and dealt with the fact that a lot of their friends and family died from complications of AIDS during the crisis. But the fact that some of the people that helped, or either feminists or lesbian, the current generation thinks that entitles them to special treatment, even though men still largely did heavy lifting back then and are still doing it now within GLBT organizations, but the men generally command the least of the social capital and have the most issues to be solved. This largely has to do with GLBT and later LGBT movements became more political from the mid-1980s up until marriage equality in 2015. Now the LGBT movement is a rudderless ship floundering about with trans issues without really doing too much to help anyone. In the next part, we'll be going over what some organizations that operate in the San Francisco Bay Area are doing, the money that they receive, and from what a community foundation. These organizations focus on LGBT issues, at least in theory, but what they focus on will paint a picture of neglect of issues faced by gay and bisexual men, and focusing on more general social issues.